All it is a little bitty surface crack.
In late August, a Forest Service ranger made the long walk up the trail with an envelope meant for Tom, a man he scarcely recognized. Tom accepted it without a word. The shake in his hands didn't come from the messenger or the climb it took to get there. It came from what the letter represented. For half a century, he had shaped his life according to his own decisions, answering only to the land around him. Now, before he even finished reading, he sensed the truth. Those decisions were no longer entirely his to make. The notice that forced a reckoning. Tom Oar sat quietly on the porch of the cabin he had built with his own hands nearly 5 decades ago. The wood beneath him carried the marks of time, just like he did. Resting on his lap was a certified letter, still sealed. From the doorway, Nancy watched him closely, a dish towel folded in her hands. After living this far from the world for so long, they had learned to read each other's silence the way others read books. "You gonna open it?" she asked gently. Tom's eyes lingered on the envelope. The official government letterhead showed faintly through the paper. For almost half a century, he had structured his life to avoid this kind of communication. Out here, mail was rare. And when it did arrive, it rarely carried good news. It usually meant paperwork, renewals, changing regulations, the outside world pushing its way into the mountains with rules that felt disconnected from the steady rhythm of seasons, trap lines, and survival. After a long pause, he finally tore the envelope open. He unfolded the single sheet slowly, as if taking his time might soften whatever words waited there. Nancy studied his expression as he read. She saw the subtle tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw settled into that familiar look, the one that meant he was absorbing something he did not want to accept. "They're updating the backcountry residence regulations," Tom said at last, his tone even but heavy. "New requirements, emergency access standards, medical evaluation and certifications for anyone over 75 living more than 20 miles from emergency services, structural inspections, liability documentation." Nancy stepped forward and sat beside him, leaning in to read over his shoulder. The language was formal, polished, and careful, but the meaning was unmistakable. The Forest Service was introducing policies meant to protect elderly residents from the risks of remote living. Anyone unable to prove they could safely remain would risk losing their residential permits. "When does it start?" Nancy asked quietly, though deep down, she suspected the timeline would be immediate. Government agencies did not send certified letters about changes years away. "January 1st, Tom replied. "They want everything submitted by November, medical clearance, an emergency evacuation plan, proof of reliable communication systems." He lowered the page and stared across the wilderness that had been his home since 1973. "They're asking me to prove I'm not too old to live here." The weight of that statement lingered between them. Tom had endured everything these mountains could throw at a man. Winters that dropped to 50 below zero. Encounters with grizzlies that could have turned fatal. Injuries treated miles away from any doctor. Equipment failures in conditions where mistakes were unforgiving. He had seen younger men attempt this life and retreat back to comfort and convenience. He had outlasted trends, cameras, and the shifting world beyond the tree line. But there was one thing he could not outlast: time. And now, through official stamps and formal wording, the government was forcing him to confront what he had quietly avoided for the past 2 years. He was 78 years old. His knees stiffened each morning before he even stepped outside. His hands no longer wrapped around tools with the same strength they once had. The trap lines that used to feel peaceful and grounding now demanded endurance. Nancy reached for his hand. Her grip was still firm, shaped by decades of splitting wood and hauling water. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Tom did not answer right away. He watched a hawk circle slowly above the valley, riding currents of air he could not see. The cabin stood strong behind him. The mountains stretched endlessly ahead. For nearly 50 years, this land had defined him. It had tested him, shaped him, and rewarded him. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice quieter than before. "But maybe the mountains are trying to tell me something, and maybe it's time I start listening." It was a simple admission, yet it carried enormous weight. For the first time in half a century, Tom Oar allowed himself to say aloud what he had only felt in passing thoughts, that his life in the wilderness might not last forever. And once that truth was spoken, nothing felt quite the same again. The winter that changed his confidence. There was one moment Tom never shared with anyone, not even Nancy. It happened in February during what was supposed to be nothing more than a routine trapline check. For decades, he had followed the same 12-mile loop. Moving through terrain, he understood better than most. People understand their own streets. Every bend in the trail, every cluster of trees, every frozen bend in the creek was familiar. But sometimes, familiarity creates a quiet overconfidence, especially when age begins to chip away at strength you once relied on, without question. That morning, he was checking a set near Wolverine Creek, a place he had named himself back in 1978, after a tense encounter with a wolverine that had left a lasting impression. Snow had fallen heavily that season, piling up to 4 feet in some stretches. Even with snowshoes, breaking trail demanded more effort than usual. Each step required force. Each breath came a little sharper. He noticed it, but as always, he pushed on. Tom Oar had never been the kind of man to admit his body was slowing down. Experience, he believed, could make up for what stamina might lack. When he reached the trap, he saw it had been triggered by something unintended, likely a branch knocked loose by wind and heavy snow. He bent to reset it, a motion he had performed thousands of times without thought. But this time, as he shifted his weight, his right knee simply gave way. There was no dramatic snap, no sharp cry of pain, just a quiet collapse. One moment, he was standing. The next, he was down in snow that suddenly felt far deeper than 4 feet. He lay there for several seconds, maybe 30, maybe a full minute. Time blurred as a different sensation crept in. Not pain, fear. The knee was not broken. He could sense that immediately, but it was not steady either. It refused to fully support him. It did not respond the way it always had. And lying there, cold beginning to seep through his layers, Tom faced a truth he had been avoiding. He was alone, 12 miles from the cabin. The temperature was falling toward 20 below zero. His knee might carry him home, or it might not. Nancy would not begin to worry until dark. She would not know exactly where he had gone. She could not call him, could not reach him. The communication systems now being demanded by the government did not exist out there. His independence, something he had always prized, suddenly felt fragile. Eventually, he forced himself upright, using his rifle for support. Step by careful step, he began the long return. What normally took 3 hours stretched into more than 6. Each stride sent a sharp reminder through his leg. Twice he had to stop, resting despite knowing that pausing in such temperatures carried its own danger. But he had no choice. By the time he reached the cabin, Nancy was already uneasy. She had been preparing to follow his tracks, despite the fading daylight. "Bad snow," he told her. "Took longer than expected." She did not question him. After nearly 50 years in the mountains together, she understood when silence meant more than words. Still, she noticed the way he favored his right leg for the next 3 weeks. The way he moved with more care, the subtle shift in the confidence that had always defined his stride. Tom told himself it was nothing, a one-time incident. Deep snow and awkward footing, bad luck. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had lived in that body for 78 years. He understood its signals. The knee had not failed by accident. It had issued a warning. The human body might endure 60 or 70 years of ordinary life. Tom had demanded far more. Decades of brutal winters, endless miles on rough ground, cold that cuts through bone, physical labor that wore joints thin. Now, inevitably, those years were catching up with him. After that day, he became more cautious. He checked his steps, moved with greater intention, listened more closely to what his body was telling him. But caution could only do so much. The mountains did not reward caution alone. They required capability, and capability was quietly fading. So, when the letter from the Forest Service arrived 6 months later, demanding medical certification that he was fit to remain in the wilderness, Tom felt 2 conflicting emotions. Resentment, because a distant official was questioning a life he had successfully lived for 5 decades. And relief, because that same demand gave shape to doubts that had begun that February afternoon, when his knee gave out 12 miles from home. The fear they could no longer ignore. The conversation both of them knew was coming did not happen right away. That evening, Tom and Nancy moved around the cabin with careful precision, like two people stepping around a crack in the floor they were not ready to look at. Nancy cooked dinner. Tom sat at the table repairing a pack strap that did not truly need fixing. And between them, resting on the wooden surface, lay the letter. Silent, official, impossible to overlook. They ate with fewer words than usual. Outside, the mountain darkness pressed tightly against the windows, sealing them inside their thoughts. Finally, when the dishes were cleared and the quiet had grown too heavy, Nancy spoke. "We need to talk about what happens if you get hurt out here." Tom did not pretend he misunderstood her meaning. "I've been hurt before. We handled it. You've been hurt before when you were 50, 60, even 70, she replied evenly. "You're almost 80 now, Tom, and we're 40 miles from the nearest road, 3 hours from basic medical care if everything goes perfectly, days if the weather turns." There was no accusation in her tone, only the steady honesty that had shaped their entire life together. Then she asked the question she had been holding back. "What happened last winter?" Tom's head lifted quickly. "Nothing happened last winter. Your knee," Nancy said quietly. "You favored it for weeks. You took 6 hours on a 3-hour trap line. Don't tell me nothing happened." For a long moment, he said nothing. He weighed whether to protect his pride or finally admit the fear that had lingered since February. "My knee gave out," he said at last. 12 miles from here. Took me 6 hours to get back. And I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been able to stand again." Nancy absorbed the words without visible surprise. She had sensed the truth long before he spoke it. She had simply waited for him to be ready. "We can't keep pretending we're 40 years old," she said gently. "We can't live like we have unlimited time and unlimited strength." "I know that." The words felt heavy, forced past decades of stubborn independence. "Do you?" she asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, you've ignored every sign that maybe it's time to rethink how we live." She glanced around the cabin, the walls they built, the life they shaped together. "I love this place, but loving something doesn't stop reality from changing." Tom rose and walked to the window, though the darkness outside showed nothing but reflection. "This is who I am, Nancy. The mountains, the trap lines, the independence. Take that away, and what's left?" "A man who lived an extraordinary life on his own terms," she answered softly. "A man who walked away from modern society and proved he could survive, more than survive. A man who showed people there are other ways to live with purpose. That's what's left." "Past tense," he muttered. "That's what I was." "No," Nancy said, stepping beside him. "That's who you are. Changing where we live doesn't erase what you've done. But dying out here because we were too proud to admit we're not young anymore, that would change how it all ends." Her words struck deeper than any regulation in a government letter. Because he knew she was right. There was a line between independence and recklessness, between self-sufficiency and self-destruction. When he was younger, that line was clear. Now it had shifted, and he had been pretending it had not. "I don't know how to be someone else," Tom admitted quietly. "I don't know how to live anywhere but here." "You're not someone else," Nancy replied. "You're Tom Oar. You'll be Tom Oar wherever you stand. The mountains didn't create you. They just gave you space to live fully. But maybe living fully now means ending this chapter before it ends badly." They stood together in the dim cabin light, two people who had chosen an uncommon path and walked it successfully for 5 decades. Now they faced something no skill or courage could outwork. Time. "The medical certification," Tom said after a long silence. "I don't think I can pass it. Not honestly." "I know," Nancy answered. "So we're really talking about leaving. We're talking about surviving," she corrected gently. "About choosing while we still have the power to choose." He stood there for a long time, turning over what survival meant when it required letting go of the very life he had fought to build. At last, his voice steadied. "I need to walk the trap lines one more time. I need to say goodbye properly. Can we wait that long before deciding?" Nancy nodded. "One more time, but we both know what the answer will be." He did not argue, because the decision, in truth, had been made months earlier, on a February afternoon when his knee failed 12 miles from home, and he took 6 long hours to walk back through snow that could have easily become his final resting place. Everything since then had simply been delaying what they both already understood: the price of living free. Tom began his final walk along the trapline before dawn, stepping into a darkness he had memorized over decades. Nancy had offered to join him, but he declined. This was something he needed to face alone, a quiet farewell to the wilderness that had been his home, his teacher, his challenger, and his refuge for 50 years. The first set lay 2 miles from the cabin, near a bend in the creek where beavers had rebuilt their dams year after year. He had named it Persistence Point long ago, admiring the animal's determination against floods and freezes. The trap was empty. Out of habit, he reset it, though he knew no one would return to check it again. For a moment, he stood still, listening to water shifting beneath thin ice. That place had taught him patience. Beaver trapping demanded observation, timing, restraint. You could not rush it. You had to study the signs and wait for the right moment. Those lessons had shaped more than his work. They had shaped his life, his marriage, even the way he read the weather. The second set stood near Wolverine Creek, where his knee had failed the previous winter. He approached carefully now, movement slower, more deliberate. The trap was frozen into ground that would soon disappear beneath snow, deeper than a tall man's height. He paused there longer than anywhere else, remembering the fear of lying in the snow, unsure if he could make it home. That place had taught him humility. Confidence without respect was arrogance, and the mountains corrected arrogance without mercy. He had seen it happen. Young men arriving with pride, some leaving wiser, some not leaving at all. By the time he reached the last set, established 5 years earlier, the sun was high and the 12 miles weighed heavily on him. His knee throbbed, his breathing came harder than it once had. Sitting on a fallen log, eating Nancy's sandwich, he admitted a truth he could no longer avoid. For 50 years, survival had meant staying. Now, survival meant knowing when to go. When the truth had to be said. Tom found Dave Wright 3 days later, making the 8-mile journey to his nearest neighbor's cabin, carrying news he had never imagined he would speak aloud. Dave was younger, in his mid-60s, still solid and strong in ways Tom clearly remembered being, but no longer was. For over 30 years, they had known each other, helping through emergencies, trading knowledge across the wide miles that separated mountain homes. Dave was splitting wood when Tom stepped into the clearing. The moment Dave saw him, something in his expression shifted. An unexpected visit out here always meant something important. He set the axe down. "Coffee's hot," he said simply. "Come on in." They sat at the rough-hewn table, steam rising between them, and for a while Tom just stared into his mug, searching for the right way to begin. In the end, he didn't dress it up. "I'm leaving, Nancy and I both. End of the season." Dave didn't react right away. His weathered face stayed still. Then he said quietly, "The Forest Service letter. You got one too?" "Month ago, I can pass the medical certification. Barely, but I can." Dave looked down into his coffee. "You can't?" "Probably could if I lied. But I'd be lying." Tom held his friend's gaze. "Had a close call last winter. Knee gave out on the trapline, 12 miles from home. Made it back, but it took 6 hours and a lot of luck. Can't keep pretending that didn't happen. Nobody would blame you for trying, for fighting it. Nancy would blame me. I'd blame myself. And the mountains, they don't care about blame. They only care about capability." He paused. "I'm 78 years old, Dave. My body's telling me things I don't want to hear. Ignoring them won't make them untrue." Dave nodded slowly. "Where will you go?" "Don't know yet. Somewhere lower, warmer, somewhere Nancy and I can manage without risking our lives every time we need supplies or medical care." A trace of bitterness slipped into his voice. "Somewhere civilized, I guess. Civilization isn't defeat, Tom. Feels like it. Feels like 50 years of proving you can live differently, live independent, and then crawling back to admit you were wrong." "You weren't wrong," Dave said firmly. "You proved exactly what you meant to prove. A man can walk away from modern society and survive on his own terms. You did it longer and better than most could imagine. Leaving now doesn't erase that. It confirms it." Tom looked up, surprised. "How?" "Because you're leaving by choice, on your terms. You're not being carried out in a body bag. You're not making Nancy watch you decline until something catastrophic happens and she's left alone. You're making a hard decision intelligently. That takes more courage than just staying until the mountains decide for you." The words settled over him like cold snow, sharp but clear. "Never thought of it that way." "Most don't. They think courage means never backing down, but real courage is knowing when to stop." Dave refilled their mugs. "Remember that winter I wanted to add another 10 miles to my trap line?" Tom nodded. You told me ambition without capability is pride looking for trouble. Said a good mountain man knows his limits and works within them. Dave smiled slightly. Now you're living your own advice. They sat quietly, two men who had chosen lives most would call extreme, even foolish. They had survived, thrived, but age had changed the math. What about you? Tom asked. How much longer? Few more years maybe, still strong enough. But I'm watching you, thinking about my own future. Might be wise to plan before I'm forced to decide. Be lonely without neighbors. It's always been lonely. That was part of the bargain. We paid it willingly. Dave met his eyes. You gave people like me permission to live differently. That doesn't disappear when you leave. Something eased in Tom's chest. Appreciate you saying that. It's true, and wherever you go, you'll still be Tom Oar. The mountains shaped you. They don't define you. They stood and shook hands. No long speeches followed, just the quiet understanding of men who knew hard truths. The 8-mile walk back felt different. Not easier. His knees still throbbed. His breath still came hard, but lighter somehow. As if Dave's words had lifted a weight he hadn't fully realized he was carrying. The season of goodbye. Preparing to leave took longer than Tom expected. Not because there was an overwhelming amount to pack, but because every object they touched carried weight. 50 years of tools, supplies, and keepsakes could not simply be boxed up without memory rising alongside them. Each item held a story, a season, a lesson earned the hard way. Nancy handled the process the way she handled most things, steady and organized. She created piles across the cabin floor. What they would take, what they would sell, what they would give away, and what would remain for whoever might one day use the cabin again. Yet, even she paused at certain things. A chipped coffee mug from their second year in the mountains, a faded wool blanket that had shielded them through countless winters, old photographs from a time when their faces were younger and the future stretched endlessly ahead. You all right? Tom asked one afternoon, noticing her standing still with the leather pouch he had crafted for their 20th anniversary. I'm grieving, she answered calmly. Not exactly for what we're losing, for what we're finishing. That's different. Tom understood. This was not about failure. It was about acknowledging that something meaningful was ending. They were not simply leaving a cabin. They were closing the chapter that had defined their entire adult lives. The final weeks blurred together. Tom walked his trap lines one last time. Not to check them, but to say goodbye. Nancy gathered the last harvest from the garden, preserving what she could and leaving the rest for wildlife. Together, they repaired sections of the cabin worn by weather, wanting it to stand strong even after they were gone. Word spread through the scattered mountain community. Neighbors made long trips to visit. Some came to share stories. Others came simply to witness the moment. Even those who barely knew Tom understood something significant was happening. When people asked why, Tom spoke plainly. Age, capability, government requirements, the knee that had failed him 12 miles from home. Most nodded with understanding. A few seemed unsettled. You're letting them win, one younger man said, gesturing vaguely towards civilization. You're proving this life isn't sustainable. Tom met him with patient eyes. I'm proving I know my limits. If you want to prove something, stay until the mountains kill you. I'd rather leave alive and on my terms. As October shifted toward November and the first heavy snows began falling, they loaded their belongings into a truck brought up the rough road for that purpose. Watching their life reduced to boxes felt strange. Watching the cabin empty felt even stranger. On their final evening, they sat on the porch as darkness settled in. Wind moved through the pines, the only sound in a world untouched by traffic or distant city noise. Do you regret any of it? Nancy asked softly. Tom thought carefully. I regret that it has to end. I regret that age catches up. I regret that regulations force the conversation. He paused. But I don't regret living this way. Not 1 year of it. Me neither, Nancy replied. It was a good life. Still is. The next morning, Tom locked the cabin door. He did not look back. Not because it would hurt, but because it would not change anything. As the truck descended toward lower ground, Tom felt both sadness and relief. The mountains had given him everything they could. Lessons, strength, identity. And now they had given him one final truth. That knowing when to leave required as much courage as choosing to stay. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel to stay with us till the very end. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next part of this journey. There's still more ahead.